There was no single day, no moment when a bell rang, no hour when the land changed hands and everyone knew it. And yet, something shifted, gradually, then completely. At some point in the story of this continent, land that had been understood as a living relationship became a legal commodity. The question that history rarely asks is, when? Not the date on a treaty, not the year of a war, but the deeper moment when the idea itself changed, when the ground beneath every nation's feet became something that could be owned, sold, and emptied of the people who had always known its name. Most of us learned this as a story of movement. Pioneers heading west, manifest destiny, progress spreading like light across a darkened map. And that story has a logic to it, because it was told by the people doing the moving. What that story quietly omits is that every mile of that movement was also someone else's staying, someone else's home, someone else's memory. The land was never empty. The question was never whether people were there. The question was whether the law, a particular civilization's law, would choose to see them. And it chose not to. Go back to the early 1800s, to the hills of what is now Georgia and Tennessee. Stand in a Cherokee town, not a camp, not a temporary settlement, a town. Feel the weight of the morning air, thick with pine and river mist. Hear the sound of a newspaper being printed in the Cherokee language for a Cherokee readership in a Cherokee Nation that had a written constitution modeled deliberately on the one the United States had recently written for itself. This was not the frontier of civilization. This was civilization, thriving, adapting, enduring. By the 1820s, the Cherokee Nation had built something extraordinary. A formal government with 3 branches, a Supreme Court, a bicameral legislature, a free press. They had schools. They had negotiated 17 treaties with the United States government, each one recognizing the Cherokee as a sovereign nation. And under each of those treaties, the United States had made a promise. The land would remain theirs. Every promise was kept until keeping it became inconvenient. Think of a woman named Ayita. We don't know her name. History didn't keep it, but she was there. She had planted corn in the same valley her grandmother had planted it. She knew which bend in the river flooded in spring. She knew the names of the mountains in a language that had carried those names for centuries. She was not living on the edge of history. She was living inside a world that worked, a world with law, with memory, with continuity, and she had no reason to believe that world was about to be made illegal. In 1830, the United States Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. It did not call for war. It did not declare conquest. It was written in the careful language of policy. The act authorized the forced relocation of all native nations east of the Mississippi River. To territory west of it, land the government designated as Indian Territory. Land it was confident. At that moment, it did not yet want. The Cherokee Nation did not accept this quietly. They sued. They went to the Supreme Court, and they won. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that the Cherokee were a sovereign nation, that Georgia's laws had no authority over their territory, that the removal was unconstitutional. Andrew Jackson looked at the ruling and chose to ignore it. He reportedly said, "Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Something irreversible had begun. Not with a battle, with a sentence. Between 1838 and 1839, approximately 16,000 Cherokee people were forcibly removed from their homeland, marched west through winter, without adequate food, without adequate shelter. Somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 died on that journey. The Cherokee called it Nana Dal Suni, the trail where they cried. We know it as the Trail of Tears. But the Trail of Tears was not an isolated event. It was a method applied with variations to nation after nation. The Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, the Potawatomi, who named their own removal the Trail of Death. Millions of acres of indigenous land transferred to state control, to speculators, to settlers who had been told and believed that this land was available, that it had been empty, that it had been waiting. History absorbed this into a narrative of inevitability. The strong replaced the weak. Civilization replaced wilderness. Progress moved in one direction. These are not descriptions. They are justifications dressed as descriptions. The Indian Removal Act was not inevitable. It was a choice made by specific men with specific interests in specific defiance of their own legal system's ruling. Gold had been found in Cherokee territory in 1829, 1 year before the Removal Act was passed. Simplifying this as expansion hides what it actually was. It was a land seizure, conducted by a government that had just told the world it was built on the principle that all men are created equal. This was not the birth of American civilization. It was the deliberate dismantling of civilizations that were already here, so that a different civilization could expand without confronting what it was displacing. The Cherokee had modeled their government on American ideals because they believed those ideals were real, that sovereignty meant sovereignty, that law meant law, that a treaty was a promise. What 1830 revealed is that those ideals had a boundary, and the boundary was drawn around the people who already owned the land someone else had decided to take. The Cherokee Nation survived. It did not vanish into history. Today, the Cherokee Nation is the largest tribal nation in the United States, with over 400,000 citizens, its own government, its own courts, its own language programs, schools, and healthcare systems. The language Sequoyah built, the syllabary that gave the Cherokee people a written voice, is still being taught, still being spoken. And in the hills of North Carolina, a community of Cherokee who hid in the mountains to avoid removal never left their homeland at all. The eastern band of Cherokee Indians still live where Ayita planted her corn. The land remembers what the maps forgot. There was no single day, no moment when a bell rang.